Attica. The day the prison walls fell, a true story of power and pain. The spark. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment if you think justice shouldn't come at the cost of humanity. This is not just another prison story, this is Attica. The morning of September 9, 1971, began like any other at Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in upstate New York. But by sunrise the air carried something different. A pulse, a hum of rebellion that no one could quite define yet. Inside cell block D, 1,200 men awoke to the sound of clanging metal, but this time, it wasn't just the guards making noise. Voices echoed through the tiers, low and charged. Someone shouted, "Today we take it back." Minutes later, a guard screamed for backup. Then chaos erupted. Prisoners stormed the gates of the yard, overpowering officers, taking keys, unlocking cells. The halls of Attica, once ruled by order and control, were now alive with fury and fear. In less than 20 minutes, the inmates controlled most of the facility. But this wasn't blind rage. What the world would later learn is that the uprising had been planned for weeks, maybe months. Whispered in mess halls. Written on scraps of paper. Passed cell to cell in code. The prisoners didn't just want better food or more yard time. They wanted human rights, medical care, fair hearings, and end to the beatings. They wanted to be seen. At 9:46 a.m., a group of guards were dragged into the yard as hostages. The inmates surrounded them, not to kill, but to bargain. A man stepped forward, tall, lean, with calm eyes behind the chaos. His name was Elliot L.D. Barkley, a 21-year-old inmate serving time for robbery. He wasn't a gang leader or a killer. He was a voice. Standing on a makeshift platform, Barkley shouted over the noise. "We are men. We are not beasts, and we will not be driven like beasts any longer." Those words would later echo around the world. By noon, the governor's office in Albany was on the line. Governor Nelson Rockefeller was briefed. Over 1,000 prisoners had taken control of Attica, holding 42 staff as hostages. The inmates had organized themselves into committees, negotiation teams, security units, and even medical responders. Reporters began gathering outside the gates. Helicopters circled overhead. Inside, tension thickened with every hour. The prisoners drafted a list, 28 demands ranging from political rights to basic decency. "We want adequate medical treatment," one point read. Another, "We want religious freedom." But outside those walls, the conversation was different. To state officials, the men inside weren't revolutionaries, they were dangerous criminals who had to be subdued. The warden, Vincent Mancusi, tried to reason with them through a bullhorn. His voice cracked. "You're making it worse for yourselves. Surrender now." No one did. By day 2, the yard had transformed into what looked like a small city. Tents made from bedsheets, signs written on cardboard, food passed around in ration circles. Barkley and a handful of others tried to maintain order. But cracks began to show. Some prisoners wanted peace. Others wanted payback. Rumors spread that a few guards had already been killed, though none of it was confirmed. In a corner of the yard, 2 inmates whispered over a torn newspaper. On it was a quote from Rockefeller saying he would not yield to the demands of criminals. That was the match that lit the fuse. At 5:30 p.m., a hostage's family went on TV, pleading for mercy. Cameras captured the anguish, a wife crying, children asking if their father was still alive. The public's sympathy shifted. The pressure grew. Inside, Barkley's voice grew hoarse. "They don't see us as men," he told one of the negotiators. "They see us as the walls themselves." That night, an eerie calm fell over Attica. Guards surrounded the facility in full riot gear. National Guard units were on standby. Negotiations had stalled. The governor refused to visit in person. And then, a warning. At dawn, a low rumble shook the air. Helicopters circled again, louder this time. One inmate pointed up. "They're coming." Another shouted, "Get ready." But as the spotlights pierced the yard, something unexpected happened. A voice on the loudspeaker, a negotiator, pleaded with the inmates to hold the line. "They're preparing to take it by force," he warned. Barkley looked up at the choppers, sweat streaking down his face, and whispered, "They'll rather see us dead than heard." That was the last calm moment before everything fell apart. Because when the first tear gas canisters dropped from the sky, the walls of Attica didn't just hold men anymore, they held ghosts waiting to be born. The siege. Smoke rose over Attica like a dark omen. The tear gas from the helicopters drifted across the yard, blinding, choking, burning. Inmates coughed and stumbled, clutching their faces. The chaos that had started as protest was now war. Outside the walls, hundreds of law enforcement officers, state troopers, corrections officers, and National Guard units were assembled in military formation, rifles loaded, orders sealed, snipers posted on rooftops. Every man out there had been told this was a mission to retake control. Inside, Elliot Barkley stood in the middle of the yard, his voice raw. "Hold the line. Don't hurt the hostages," he shouted, waving his arms through the smoke. He still believed that reason could win, that humanity could be salvaged. But the sound of boots and gunfire in the distance said otherwise. The governor, Nelson Rockefeller, had made his decision hours earlier. Despite desperate pleas from negotiators and civil rights leaders, even a personal message from the hostages' families, Rockefeller refused to enter the prison. He didn't want to negotiate with criminals. Instead, he ordered an assault. At 9:46 a.m., the signal was given. A helicopter swooped low, dropping canisters of CS gas, filling the sky with a gray haze that turned men into silhouettes. Then the gunfire began. Troopers on the walls opened fire. The official record would later say they used non-lethal force at first, but witnesses said otherwise. Inside, prisoners and hostages alike dove to the ground, hands over their heads. Some screamed prayers. Others screamed names. One of the guards, William Quinn, who had been taken hostage on the first day, lay unconscious from a head wound. A prisoner tried to drag him to safety, shouting, "He's hurt. He's hurt." But in the smoke, there was no mercy, no distinction between hostage or inmate. A voice over the loudspeaker roared, "Cease fire. Cease fire." But the shots kept coming. In less than 15 minutes it was over. When the smoke cleared, the yard was silent, except for the sound of boots crunching over gravel and bodies. 39 men were dead. 10 were hostages. 29 were inmates. But the truth at first was buried under lies. The official statement declared that the inmates executed the hostages before being subdued. Newspapers printed it in bold headlines. The public believed it, for a while. It wasn't until the autopsies came in that the truth clawed its way out. Every hostage had been killed by police gunfire. The aftermath was chaos, not just in the prison but across the country. Reporters flooded Attica, demanding answers. Families arrived, begging to see their loved ones only to be turned away. Inside the compound, the survivors, beaten, handcuffed, and half-blind from the gas, were lined up on the ground. Guards walked between them, swinging batons, shouting curses. 4 hours, the sound of crying echoed through the ruins of what had once been a rebellion for justice. In a corner, a cameraman captured a haunting image, Barkley's body lying face down in the mud. A single bullet wound to the back. His blood soaking into the same earth where he had shouted for dignity. Later, when questioned, one officer would admit under oath, "We were told to leave no one standing who resisted." But those words never made the headlines. Days later, Governor Rockefeller finally visited the prison. He walked through the yard surrounded by armed guards, looking at the wreckage, the burned mattresses, the spent shells, the walls stained with smoke. When asked if he regretted his decision, he simply said, "We did what was necessary." But across America, the images told a different story. Civil rights leaders called it a massacre behind walls. Politicians called it a tragedy of order. The public was torn. Some saw the inmates as monsters who deserved it. Others saw them as martyrs who had dared to demand humanity. In the following weeks, a quiet terror ruled Attica. The surviving inmates were stripped naked, beaten, and forced to crawl across broken glass. Many were denied medical treatment. Some disappeared into solitary confinement, never to be seen again. But even as the prison tried to erase the memory, the outside world couldn't forget. Reporters, activists, and lawyers began piecing together what really happened. One young journalist, Tom Wicker of the New York Times, had been inside Attica as a mediator during the standoff. He testified that the inmates' demands were reasonable and peaceful before the assault began. His reports painted a picture that no one wanted to see, a government that had chosen control over compassion. And yet, even with the truth emerging, justice didn't follow. No officer was ever convicted. No one was held accountable for the killings. But something had changed, a fracture in the system that could never fully heal. Attica had become a symbol not just of rebellion, but of what happens when power refuses to listen. That night, in a quiet cemetery in upstate New York, Barkley's mother stood over her son's grave. Her voice broke as she whispered, "He wasn't perfect, but he was right." And miles away, inside Attica's rebuilt walls, an inmate carved 3 words into the concrete of his cell. "We were men." The reckoning. The silence that followed the massacre was heavier than the gunfire that caused it. For weeks, Attica sat behind its walls like a wound the state didn't want to look at. The smell of tear gas lingered in the halls. Bullet holes scarred the concrete. And for the survivors, guards and inmates alike, sleep became a battleground of its own. But outside those walls, the world was waking up. Reporters began digging into timelines, transcripts, autopsies. Every page revealed something darker: lies told to protect power, evidence destroyed, voices silenced. The truth, like a body buried too shallow, began to rise. It started with one phone call. A coroner from Buffalo quietly contacted a local journalist. "The hostages weren't killed by inmates," he said. "They were killed by trooper bullets, all of them." The revelation spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the country printed headlines that shook the public's faith in government authority. "Police bullets killed all hostages at Attica," read the New York Times. The lie had been exposed, and suddenly the state's hands were no longer clean. In Albany, Governor Rockefeller's office scrambled for control. The official line shifted overnight, from heroic rescue to tragic necessity. Behind closed doors, transcripts of phone calls revealed Rockefeller's cold refusal to visit the prison or negotiate with inmates. His political ambitions for national office outweighed the lives on the line. Meanwhile, Tom Wicker, the journalist who had witnessed the uprising firsthand, wrote a scathing report titled, "A Time to Die." His words cut through America's conscience. What happened at Attica was not just a failure of prison policy, it was a failure of humanity. His account, paired with photographs of lifeless bodies lined across the yard, forced the public to see what had been hidden: men stripped of dignity, executed by the very system meant to contain them. But justice, as always, was complicated. In 1974, 3 years after the riot, the state brought indictments. Not against the officers who opened fire. Not against the leaders who gave the order. Against the inmates. 62 men were charged with crimes ranging from assault to murder. The message was clear: silence the survivors, protect the state. One of the defendants, Frank "Big Black" Smith, had been a yard leader during the rebellion. During the assault, guards had beaten him nearly to death, forcing him to lie on a table while they crushed his body under boots and rifle butts. They burned him with cigarettes, mockingly asking if he still felt like a man. Now that same man was being charged as the villain. But Smith didn't stay silent. He began to speak out, in interviews, in courtrooms, in letters smuggled to reporters. His words were calm, steady, and filled with a conviction that shook the narrative. They killed their own. And they blamed us so they wouldn't have to look in the mirror. Gradually the tide turned. Activists, lawyers, and even some politicians demanded accountability. Civil rights groups, led by the NAACP and the ACLU, filed lawsuits on behalf of the inmates, exposing years of abuse inside Attica. In 1976, a grand jury quietly concluded that the use of deadly force was unjustified. But no officer was ever charged. The case was closed in silence, justice sacrificed for politics. Years passed, but Attica refused to fade into history. Books were written. Films were made. Survivors told their stories on stages and in classrooms. The word Attica became more than a place, it became a symbol. In 2000, nearly 30 years later, the state of New York finally settled a civil lawsuit with surviving inmates and families of the dead, paying out $12 million in damages. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was acknowledgement. A small, bitter gesture that said, yes, you were wronged. Yet for many, the ghosts of Attica never left. In the old cell blocks, long abandoned now, visitors reported hearing echoes of footsteps, faint voices in the distance. But there were no spirits. Only memories. The echoes of men whose screams had once filled those halls. A former guard, now in his 70s, later confessed in an interview. "We weren't fighting monsters in that yard. We were fighting men who just wanted to be treated like human beings." He paused, voice cracking. "And we lost our humanity trying to stop them." In the end, the legacy of Attica wasn't written in blood, but in the conversations it forced, about race, power, and what justice really means. It became the mirror America didn't want to face, reflecting the cost of control and the fragility of freedom. Every prison reform that came after, every protest, every demand for rights behind bars, carried the same haunting refrain: remember Attica. Because behind those concrete walls, under that cloud of gas and gunfire, men had dared to say something that frightened the system more than violence ever could. We are men. We deserve to live like it. Today the remains of Attica's old yard still stand: cracked asphalt, rusted fences, the faint outline of where the uprising began. But if you listen closely when the wind cuts through the bars, you can almost hear it. The echo of defiance that refused to die. A whisper carried through time. Attica is all of us. If this story shook you, if it made you question power or justice or the price of silence, then remember this. History repeats itself only when we stop paying attention. So hit subscribe, because the next story might just prove it's happening again.